Welcome to the Equity Conscious Leader, a new generation equity podcast and YouTube channel where we chat with leaders about tangible system change and strategies to advance and sustain equity work in their organizations. Our conversations dive deep into the 6 dimensions of equity conscious leadership. So how do you lead with transformational system change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Let's find out on this episode of the Equity Conscious Leader with your host and educational equity leader, Dr. Jag Lathan.
Welcome, Dr. Tacey Rodgers. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It is just a pleasure to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and your journey in education? My name is Dr. Tacey Rodgers, and I serve in public education. I started my career, I was a paraprofessional at an adult school, and shortly after that transitioned into teaching. I loved being in the classroom so much. I didn't want to support the teachers. I wanted to be the teacher. And I loved serving adults, adult learning and adult andragogy has been like the focus of my career. And I feel like adults fill my cup. And communing with them and fellowshipping with them and growing together, I've always loved. I then transitioned to a global nonprofit assessment provider where I supported districts across California with a lot of data literacy, assessment implementation, a lot of questions and conversations around equity, who has access to courses, advanced courses at the secondary level, and also around college going rates, who is being prepared for post-secondary education and all the options that come with post-secondary education. I then transitioned back to the public sector where I currently serve. I'm serving school districts in Northern California, also with data literacy and assessment implementation, but focused on the state assessments in California. And so I'm very honored to be able to support school districts in that way. And then because I love teaching and adult learning, I do adjunct at a few universities often. And so I'm thankful for that experience to keep touch with the classroom environment, and serving our up and coming educators as well. That's awesome. Thank you so much. So you're here today to talk with us about data implementation, accountability, like all those things around equity. One area of new generation equity's work is thinking about systems and equity. Like, how do we actually transform systems to benefit those on the margins, right? In education, in other areas of industry as well. And you have been like a pioneer in a lot of work around data and assessments. And so today we're going to talk about mostly dimensions 5 and 6 of the Equity Conscious Leadership Framework. And I am just excited about this conversation. So when you think of systems and when you think of equity, what comes to mind connected to data?
Okay. Wow, it's a big question. When I think of systems and equity and the data that's, I want to say, permeates all of the system, I think about the constant inquiry, right? Like this position of inquiry. Because if we are operating as a system, then we are, with an equity lens, would be constantly asking ourselves, what's working, what's not, why, who else can we ask, who else can inform us, and how do we know that it's working or not working? And even as we invite others to our table, other voices, other experiences, other experts, other professionals within our system, external to our system, we, in that conversation, have to ensure that it's not only anecdotal, right? Well, I hear this or I hear, but what is it that you know and can prove? Because if we're talking about a system and evaluating it, that's the equity piece, right? We're evaluating a system. It's not about what we hear and think and assume and feel. It's about where the evidence is. And so that the piece of translating the thinking, the feeling, the hearing, the assuming, we have to be able to translate that and or back it up with facts and figures and what we can actually count and prove, the tangible pieces of it.
And it's so interesting in the world of education. So like you, I've been a teacher, an administrator, principal, and, different roles in education. And my whole mission, literally, since I started teaching, my first 5 years was in Los Angeles Unified School District. And it was all about equity, right? I didn't have the language for it at that time as a new teacher, but I knew what I experienced growing up in the Bay Area. And I thought, how do I help make this different? This experience different for students, right? And data was a big piece of that. And I think when I'm hearing what you're saying is so true about the evidence, and in the world of equity, a lot of times when people on the margins, for example, I'm going to say like for students, African American students, Latino students, students who are learning English as an additional language, the data is there for us. It's very clear, and it's been not very good for decades, right? But folks don't always either believe the data or know what to do with the data, or if I feel like we keep justifying, right? Like this is what the data says. We know it, right? I've been in districts where, in schools, when I first came, for example, one school, it was like 15% maybe of the students were proficient in reading. Wow, maybe. It was very low. And I'm like, okay, so we have the data. It's not change. It wasn't changing unless we do something differently with it. So what kind of comes to mind when you think about that in terms of we have a plethora of data out there? Mm-hmm. Are we not looking at the right data? Are we not using it correctly? Like, just talk a little bit about that.
What comes to my mind, it's a big question. And what comes to my mind is being intentional about the focus, because it appears that we oftentimes in our systems, especially in K-12 education, we have a lot of priorities, a lot of initiatives, a lot of efforts to ensure that the schools are robust and offering an array of opportunities and things of that nature, which are great. And the focus in terms of where the resources are aligning. So like in your literacy example, if increasing that 15% of students being literate, if that's a goal, a true focus, then that means it's going to be the number one, right, allocation of resources. That means that in each setting where projects are being discussed or priorities or how time is being spent, in each of those settings, that's going to be the goal always. So the thought would be that the system would then be constantly tracking their progress towards that goal. So if we're at 15% at the beginning of the school year, where are we at the end of quarter one? It should have increased. And if not, what's the investment in professional learning for the teacher? What's the investment in professional learning for the administrators? Like, how are they being supported to prioritize?
Right.
If that's the goal.
Yeah. Right. And I like the monitoring piece that you talked about. Like, what does it look like in quarter one? What it right? So being very intentional about how we actually track information is important. And oftentimes I'm noticing that people wait, I call it the autopsy. So they wait until the end of the school year and then they're like, oh, so now we're at 15.1%, or maybe we're at 12% now, right? Because there was no real monitoring of not only student progress, but monitoring of the implementation piece of it. Like, what is it that we wanted to try? What did we try? And how do we know if those moves that we are making are actually making a difference for students?
Right.
So that also brings me to impact.
Yeah. Yes, an impact. And as we were preparing for this conversation, impact is I think of it like a big pool. I keep closing my eyes because I'm like visually, the images come to my mind visually, right? Like as we're describing impact. And it's one thing to say the goal of a system in the literacy example is to increase literacy, move it up from 15%. And it's not just done. It's not just something that, the teachers can do that or the schools can do that, right? But there has to be a support. And so in that support, impact includes the experience of each player in the system working towards this goal. So the players are the teachers, the instructional coaches, the administrators, the principals, assistant principals, right? Students, family, the family. Yeah. So when you're talking about impact, what is their experience of working towards this goal, right? And that's a different set of questions, right? So that I think of literally being able to document these unique experiences at these different levels across the system, because we know that our outcome is 15% of our students are literate. So if that's the quantitative piece, then what's the human experience of it? That's the question I didn't want to ask, right? Yeah. Like, what does that mean to a teacher to know that 15% of their students on their caseload are literate? And what does that mean to a parent to know that your student is able to read at this level or not able to read? Like, what does that mean to them?
And I know some practices that people use to learn more or to get that data, which is a lot of qualitative data, are like focus groups, empathy interviews, just really having conversations with the people who are most impacted by the inequity, right? And 15%, or anything less than 100%, in my opinion, 15% of students being literate, that is a harm that we're doing to the other percent of students, the majority of the students who are not excelling, who are not proficient on grade level. And so what is their experience in school? What is their experience? And how do you actually get that information? So I know I just said focus groups, empathy, interviews, one-on-one conversations, but what else might we think about, or might educators think about, in terms of how do we learn from kids, from communities? Like, what is the data we can actually begin to collect about that?
It's such a real question. And that's the equity piece of impact. Because if I can't explain student Tacey's experience in being illiterate, then I'm not fully articulating the impact of my system. And another way, in addition to those that you shared, could be shadowing, like shadowing a student for a day. I remember there was a superintendent in California, and this made the press, that in their back to school in-service, every principal in that district was required to know a student's name and to follow that student, check in with that student every week, it was me and Jag. Like, Jag was my student, right? And I was responsible for her experiences in the school that year. And that relationship building, I bring up that example only to think about shadowing. Can you articulate what is the student Tacey, her unique experience? And then once in this model of shadowing students, and you have many educators in the building responsible for shadowing a student, then you begin to identify what's the commonality of what we've learned. We've shadowed these students for a couple of weeks. We know where they live. We know their address. There was another superintendent, I forget if it was in California or not, but they drove through neighborhoods of students based on the students' zip codes, just the neighborhoods. So not even students' houses and family, just the neighborhoods, to understand what students are going through to even get to school. And I think of, if we're shadowing our students, what themes what are the commonalities? What are the differences, right? Like, because literacy can impact other portions of the student. And so I would, my thought is that that impacts the student's experience, speaks to the impact of the system, is what I'm trying to say.